Today Matter.
Good morning, everybody. I would first like to thank Thula and Eddie for organising this symposium or colloquium and inviting me. I've been trying to write this paper for ages, and I'm still only about quarter boiled at this point. But it finally forced me to get some ideas down on paper and to read all of Sue's work as well, which I've been putting off because, of course, as you know, when it comes to speaking about South Africa's relations with the Smith regime, with Rhodesia during UDI, Sue's the expert in this field, particularly when it comes to diplomatic and political relations. I'd like to think that I'm going to add something about the military angle today. If I can make any contribution at all to our understanding of these relations, it might be to that, with regard to that sphere. I was also rather relieved yesterday when Eddie said to me they were looking for overview papers rather than detailed, fleshed out papers. And mine's very much an overview, borrowing, as you'll see, heavily on the work of Sue, and to a lesser extent Jamie Miller's work, his recent book, which I have reviewed. Okay, so you will see that my title has changed somewhat from the initial abstract that I submitted. I've now called it Common Cause, Incompatible Interests, and the question mark has kind of disappeared from the screen. I'm also have somewhat limited the period at which I'm going to look, and that in part represents the files that I was able to consult in the South African National Defence Archives, and I can say more about those later. Okay, let me start by saying that during the UDI era, the Rhodesian Front and South African National Party governments might have shared a common cause, but did not share convergence of interests. Both parties regarded white civilization, and for that read white supremacy in the Southern African region, to be imperiled. Both feared the spectre of the violence followed by a white exodus that had occurred in Kenya and Congo, and both were concerned at the perceived threats by radical black nationalists whom they believed to be stooges of the Soviet Union, not Russia, and the forces of communism. Pleasure, Vladimir. Although it has to be said, when you read the South African defense documents, they always speak of Russia. They never speak of the Soviet Union. Yeah, Sue would have noticed that as well, and I guess everybody else in the room. It's always Russia. But because both parties sought to manage the process of decolonization on their own terms and in their own time, they were unable to align their strategies. Smith was leery of South African hegemony and Afrikaner domination of the region, while Foster distrusted the Rhodesian leaders' intransigence, particularly his insistence on retaining the Westminster system, albeit with a qualified franchise. Obviously, this was at odds with South Africa's policy of apartheid, or what Foster preferred to call separate development, the idea of a constellation of states, or shall I say quasi-states, quasi-states under Pretorian hegemony. Sue, it's kind of daunting to quote Sue, and I hope I quote it correctly, sums up the stark divergences between South Africa and Rhodesia's political military strategy around 76 in the following terms. This is from a paper on the Kissinger initiatives. Smith's intention was to focus first and foremost on the use of force and bringing terrorism under control, Vorster, on the other hand, was convinced that the RF government would not get an acceptable political solution without Rhodesian blacks receiving a more substantial role in parliament, if not majority rule. Notwithstanding these differences, Vorster's government provided overt and covert support to Rhodesia. Financial aid, such as loans used for the construction of strategically important railway lines, communications and trade agreements, and so on, were arranged by the parties. Between 1968 and early 1976, Pretoria provided Salisbury with approximately 82 million rands worth of direct material assistance that covered the costs of a range of military hardware, including armoured vehicles, mortars, mines, grenades, ammunition, and so on, camping equipment, and what have you. Further costs were shared on a 50-50 basis, according to what was called the South African Rhodesia Assistance Committee, or SARAC formula, 50-50 shared costs of certain of the items that I've previously outlined. In addition, the South African Air Force supplied helicopters and fixed-wing light aircraft accompanied by pilots and technicians who provided training and maintenance for these craft. South African police counter-insurgency units were deployed alongside their Rhodesian counterparts, the British South African police. And of course, this served the double purpose of not only extending the perimeter of South Africa's security cordon, but also provided training for the South African police. But if you read some of the memoirs, and I'm thinking one by Chris Wormsley in particular called Mugabe, My Part in His Victory, the tension between politicians was replicated on the ground between the BSAP and the SAP. The SAP units were withdrawn, as I'm sure we all know, in August 1975. And this was done for political rather than operational reasons. It was part of Vorster's détente initiative. In any event, Smith made it quite clear that he felt that he resented being held to ransom by Pretoria. Relations between Vorster and Smith during the 1976 Kissinger initiatives, as Sue has shown, became severely strained. And as a consequence, it might be expected that Pretoria would have severed its lifeline to Salisbury. But instead, in March 1977, the Defence Planning Committee resolved, and I quote, "We must give the Rhodesians maximum assistance provided it is on a clandestine basis that cannot be traced back to the RSA. Consequently, the amount of material assistance furnished by Pretoria increased massively between October 1977 and December 1979. And I'm not sure how well you can see these figures. I'm told we're not supposed to look at the slides, so I'm not sure how I'm going to actually do this. And they're very unclear. This is a document dated May. You can't see the year of 1980, but you can see in broad brushstrokes, at any rate, the amount of material assistance, and this was particularly geared towards the provision of military hardware that the SADF and the security apparatus in South Africa provided for Salisbury. And you can see how these figures reached a considerable high peak towards the end of 1979, by which stage, of course, the interim government is already in place. In fact, when Muzarewa was held the top office in the country in that interim window. What was it? 18 months? No, it wasn't. It was about 8 months. So. That's when South Africa's aid was at a peak. But you can also see from the figures, the overall figures, this is quite a considerable amount across the period, 75 to 80, amounting to 190 million rand. In addition, it has to be said that South Africa provided a lot of loans, credit facilities. In fact, Pik Botha reported to a cabinet committee in February of 1980 that the total amount that Zimbabwe Rhodesia rather, owed the South African government at that time was 430 million rand. These figures are derived from the files that I mentioned that I came across almost inadvertently when I was doing some work in the Defence Archives. It wasn't something I was actually looking for, but I thought nobody seems to have pinpointed these or highlighted these in any of the work to date, and I put them aside with every intention of using them. And as I say, it's only now that I finally made some reference to them. Although I have noticed in Jamie Miller's footnotes, he's also accessed these files, but although he doesn't reference these particular figures because it's beyond his period. And another interesting table, while we're talking about tables, and I'm doing everything that I shouldn't be doing by looking at these slides, and again, not very clear, I'm afraid, but this was a document compiled by the South Africans and sent to Muzorewa to OK, essentially pinned his signature to and acknowledged that these were currently, and this is also early 1980, these were the South African forces that were serving, if that's the right word, in Zimbabwe Rhodesia at the time. The personnel, you can see 6 infantry companies, and I think that included a Parabat division, and it makes reference to 7 fixed-winged transport aircraft, that would be Cessnas, and 11 helicopters with crews. Those would have been Alouettes, I think, the French helicopter. The ones used as gunships. Yeah. And then of course there's a whole list of arms and ammunition and all sorts of equipment. As you can see, some of it was on loan and was expected that it would be returned in due course. A lot of it, of course, was not necessarily returned. Some of the armoured vehicles, for instance, and as you all know, South Africa then went and destroyed some of these vehicles beyond the creation of the Zimbabwean state. So these are just some of the statistics giving some hard data, because there's always been quite a lot of guesswork and supposition about exactly the extent of South African support, not only of the Smith regime, but of the interim Zimbabwean Rhodesian regime. And as you can see from these figures, they seem to have stepped up the amount of support after P.W. Botha becomes Prime Minister, and I'll get back to that point in a moment, but particularly when Muzorewa takes the reins. Okay, so what I hope to reveal or suggest in this paper is that even before Foster's long-serving Minister of Defence, P.W. Botha, succeeded him as Prime Minister in 1978, the extent of South African military support for Zimbabwe Rhodesia increased markedly. Unlike Foster, who viewed military support, and again I use Sue's words, as a policy of last resort, Botha had little or no qualms about military collaboration with an intervention in Rhodesia. I think in Foster's case, of course, you've got to bear in mind that the Angolan debacle had served as a lesson for his administration, at any rate, that South Africa should not contemplate the idea of direct military intervention. And of course, he pursued more of a diplomatic initiative than a military one. And this is part of the argument that I want to make. My understanding of Pretoria's political diplomatic relations with Salisbury for the period of UDI owes much to Sue's and work, as I've said, and to that of Jamie Miller. Both these scholars have undertaken assiduous research in the Department of Foreign Affairs records, in the South African National Archives, and of course in the Ian Smith papers housed in Corey Library at my institute. Onslow's focus on diplomacy during the Foster years is justified as the doves, so-called doves, especially the DFA, the Department of Foreign Affairs, were instrumental in giving shape to much of South Africa's policy towards Rhodesia. However, Miller's consultation of the SADF records at the SANDF archives adds another layer to our understanding of the changing power dynamics within Foster's cabinet, especially as regards the increasing influence of the military security cluster in determining policy directions. Miller notes that Foster was seen to be jettisoning white solidarity by selling out Salisbury in favor of détente and with Black Africa in order to win favor with Washington and London. His own Minister of Defense, that's Botha, regularly undermined his diplomacy with respect to Rhodesia. In fact, Botha likened Foster's détente to appeasement, with all its connotations of craven capitulation to the forces of communist-backed African nationalism. While Foster had the support of the MP caucus, he had no counter to Botha's Cold War logic. Following Foster's failure to deliver a negotiated settlement between Smith and the Zimbabwean nationalists, his position as what they call hoofleier, head chief leader, was compromised by his loss of authority, and he effectively surrendered the initiative to the Hawks. In Miller's words, Foster lost control of the conversation as anti-communist rhetoric in the guise of total onslaught was ratcheted up by the military security cluster. As a consequence, the doctrine of total strategy, modeled on the counter-revolutionary thinking of the French theorist André Bouffray, came to dominate not only strategic planning but public discourse in South Africa. National security became the be-all and the end-all of Pretoria's policy making. And as a consequence, I would add that Rhodesian security, of course, was relegated to very much a secondary role. So what I would like to do is to build on the seminal work of Sue and Onslow and Jamie Miller by providing a more expansive account of the military support accorded to Rhodesia during the period 1976 to 1980. And I think, as I say, in this sense, it's useful that Jamie Miller's work has not covered this entire period, but at least shown the dynamics at play in the Foster cabinet prior to his loss of power as a consequence of the information scandal. My contribution to our knowledge of the late UDI period then is to underscore the influence of total strategy in Pretoria's approach to dealings with Salisbury. It is apparent that even as Foster pursued his diplomatic initiative with the Kissinger talks, the strategy went hand in hand with the use of military assistance as leverage to force Smith to the negotiating table with the Zimbabwean nationalists. But the failure of the strategy, coupled with Botha's accession to the highest office, and I think I would add as well the fact that Botha delegated the portfolio of Minister of Defence to his close ally Magnus Milan, is also very significant, marked a shift that resulted in the pursuit of total strategy beyond South Africa's borders. And I think this is the key point I'm trying to make. My contention is that Pretoria's agenda increasingly fell under the sway of the military intelligence nexus. My own reading of the files of the Chief of the Defence Force archives, including those from which these documents and records are drawn, reveals that the SADF began to explore new avenues for the provision of military assistance to Salisbury following the demise of exercise Al-Qora. That's the alliance between Salisbury, Lisbon, and Pretoria that Rob McNamara and Philippe de Menezes have written quite extensively about. And of course, that lasted until 1974. Thus, SARAC, that's the South African Rhodesian Assistance Committee, which I've alluded to already, which was chaired by the Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs, Brand Fourie, was in effect supplanted by the Rhodesian Joint Planning Committee that was dominated by military personnel. The Rhodesian Joint Committee's stated purpose was, and I quote, to conduct total war in Rhodesia. Now, this is according to document dated April of 1979. The Minister of Defence's office also sought to coordinate and oversee the efforts of the 8 or so committees that had liaised with Salisbury in the past. In other words, there were committees, for instance, for cooperation between the Air Force. There was another one between the military. There were trade relations conducted through the South African mission in Salisbury. So there were all these, I've counted in the documents a reference to 8 different avenues or channels of liaison, and the securocrats tried to bring this all together under one roof, as it were. At the same time as coordinating these liaisons and the cooperation with the Rhodesians, the SADF developed its own channels of communication and cooperation independently of other agents with the security cluster. In other words, what I'm kind of suggesting is that the military were elbowing the diplomats out, the Department of Foreign Affairs and other officials who had played a leading role in dealings with Salisbury prior to that. The defense were literally muscling them out and making this their terrain. So there's evidence to suggest that under Botha there was a reorientation of policy towards Rhodesia, and that the SADF called the shots with respect to determining the nature of its involvement in its northern neighbours' affairs. Okay, that's the broad sketch and outline, and I'm probably just going to curtail it there because, quite frankly, I haven't written up much of the documentation and explored it in great depth and in detail, but I can perhaps try and deal with any questions that you might have in question time. But let me just try end by summarizing what I've been trying to suggest in this paper. I think it's fair to say that on the strength of the documentation that I've seen in the Defence Force archives, that whereas Foster used South African financial and military support as leverage to secure a settlement in Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, Botha invested in it as a blunt instrument to fight terrorism beyond South Africa's borders. If we are looking for analogies, I would liken Foster's strategy, hardly a subtle strategy in its own right, but it's something like a blowtorch, turning up the heat, getting Smith to the negotiating table where he could, using financial inducements and incentives and this SAP in the military as some kind of muscle, but then withdrawing them when he's trying to show to Salisbury that they were indeed reliant on Pretoria's assistance. I think in contrast to Foster's strategy, which by South African standards might be deemed subtle, I think Botha's was rather less so. In fact, I would say Botha's strategy, so-called total strategy, was about as subtle as a sledgehammer. Perhaps I'll just leave it on that note and try to field any questions. Otherwise, plead ignorance where I'm unable to do so. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Gary. I'm just wondering, in the context of your presentation, did the shift towards a more military-centred focus by P.W. Botha, did it entail any break with the overall parameters and objectives of John Vorster's policy? I mean, did he contest the idea that there would be a transition whereby Rhodesia would have to disappear, or was he trying to use military force to try and stop that from occurring?
No, I believe that Botha believed in the inevitability of a transition and decolonization in Salisbury, but on terms that he hoped he could control. I think if I think Vorster was more prepared, or more readily prepared, to leave the outcome to negotiations between the Zimbabweans themselves, or Rhodesians and Zimbabweans. Whereas I think Vorster Botha, in my mind at any rate, very definitely wanted to ensure that whoever came to power in Salisbury would be a party that they would be able to have some control over. And that would be, in Botha's definition, what he would see as the moderate nationalists, the Muzarewas, the Sitolis, both of whom prostituted themselves to Pretoria. I mean, what I didn't say in the presentation, and this is also shown in the documentation, that both Muzarewa, in a personal capacity to fight the elections of 1970 and 1980, accepted large amounts of funding from Pretoria. Sitoli did the same thing. And even Nkomo was drawn into discussions with Pretoria at one point. But I don't think he quite prostituted himself to the same extent that the first two did. So the difference I see is that, and maybe I'm overstating this difference, okay? But I get the impression that Vorster believed that he was willing to allow the Zimbabweans to reached a point where they would arrive at a settlement, not one which not that he believed that the Westminster system was the way to go, but arrive at a settlement that the Zimbabweans carried the day in and initiated, although he wanted to set it in motion, that they would be able to see it through. Whereas in my mind, Botha was very much more of a, for want of a better term, a control freak, wanting to be able to assert South African preponderance, hegemony through moderate nationalist parties in Salisbury.
Maybe a strange question. Who invented the total strategy? Who was the author of this term?
You mean what I've called the total strategy beyond South Africa's borders?
No, sorry, total onslaught. I mean total onslaught.
Well, it came out of the 1980 Defence White Paper. And the military establishment, particularly a general called Pops Fraser, took the ideas of André Bruffret, the French strategic theorists, and also the American counterinsurgency boffin McEwen. And he kind of watered them down, and he wrote up a manual, in effect, which was circulated amongst the officer classes in the SADF. So it was a version of counterinsurgency theory that drew on, particularly on Algeria and Vietnam, and to a lesser extent Malayan situation. And Pops Fraser was the kind of key thinker, although, as I say, I'm not sure that there was too much intellectual input. Not much of it was original at all. And this was then filtered through Milan as chief of the Defence Force, found its way into the White Paper of 1980, and then it became the common discourse within the military establishment. And as I say, it went even further. I mean, total onslaught became part of the public discourse in South Africa. So it was very much a second-hand reworking of ideas gleaned from counterinsurgency operations elsewhere, which was thought to have relevance to South Africa. But as I'm suggesting, Botha went one step further and said wanted to apply this beyond South Africa's borders as well.
Gary, thank you very much indeed. I'm very interested to explore this idea of the SADF developing their own channels of communication. Did they develop them with Rhodesian military, the Rhodesian military community, particularly General Walls, of course, as Commander-in-Chief of the Rhodesian Security Forces, to the extent that Rhodesian diplomats and politicians were effectively sidelined in the same way that you're suggesting they did to the diplomats in Pretoria? Or were they, in fact, setting themselves up as an alternative locus of thinking in Pretoria, directed to the Rhodesian government, both under Smith and then also, of course, under Muzorewa?
I think the latter, okay. Because that committee that I mentioned, SARAC, at which had previously held meetings in Salisbury, and diplomats, foreign affairs officials, military security personnel seemed to meet in Salisbury. At one point, and I forget exactly when it was decided to relocate their meetings to Pretoria. I would suggest that probably gave the military and the military security cluster better control over operations and a better ability to coordinate operations from Pretoria. But I'm not suggesting for a moment that all those previous channels of communication would suddenly terminate, because one still finds, for instance, letters exchanged between the Chief of the Air Force, I forget his name, McLaren, I think, and Bob Rogers, for instance, the Chief of the South African Air Force. So in one letter, when South Africa withdrew their in 1976, when they withdraw, well, publicly they give out the idea that South Africa was withdrawing all its military personnel. There's an exchange between McLaren and Rogers, and McLaren says, kind of, please leave your pilots and your technicians here. We're still dependent on them, pretty much. They are temporary Rhodesians. And then there's this exchange with Rogers, and Rogers seems to be quite open to the idea. And then Magnus Malan intervenes, and he says, no. Well, he kind of compromises in as much as he says, all right, he eventually agrees to leave some of the craft behind, repatriate the technicians and the other personnel, the pilots, obviously. But he says that the principle of 50-50 basis, that SARAC formula that I spoke about, must be employed in this case. In other words, what we'll do is that we'll leave the equipment behind, but we expect the Rhodesians to bear 50% of the costs. But we're not going to replace them if they're destroyed. They're going to have to replace destroyed equipment, aircraft, parts, supplies themselves. But we would apply this 50-50 formula.